In southwestern China, a Sichuan Airlines Airbus A319 is cruising calmly at 32,000 feet. But suddenly, the first officer's windshield cracks. A spiderweb of cracks is now present, turning the windshield almost opaque. Concerned, the flight crew watches the cracks grow and grow, as they are suddenly interrupted by a warning and an electronic checklist. But before the pilots can even begin the checklist, the first officer's windshield violently shatters into 1,000 small pieces. The cabin pressure quickly escapes the aircraft through the gaping hole where the window used to be, sucking the first officer partly outside the A319 for a short while. Today, we are going to take a look at the amazing story of Sichuan Airlines Flight 8633. Welcome to airspace. Sichuan Airlines Flight 8633 departed Chongqing in the morning hours of May 14, 2018. Its route took it via Chengdu to Lhasa, Tibet. About an hour after departure, the three pilots of the Airbus A319 were having a friendly chat while they were cruising over the mountains west of Chengdu. The crew was quite young, with two captains aged 46 and 34, as well as a first officer in the right seat, aged 27. But suddenly, the peace was disturbed by a cracking sound. When the first officer looked up, he now saw that his windshield had developed many small cracks that were beginning to multiply. For now, it held, and the crew took immediate action. Seeing that they were cruising over high terrain, the captain did not feel comfortable to continue the flight and decided to divert the plane to Chengdu. Should the windshield shatter completely now, the crew would have to perform an emergency descent over mountainous terrain, a complicated maneuver that requires immaculate pre-planning and position awareness. Just as the crew requested to turn around to Chengdu, the pilots were confronted with a warning of the electronic aircraft monitoring system. The windshield heating element of the first officer's window had failed. The pilots quickly connected the dots and realized that the failed heating element must have something to do with the cracked windshield, or vice versa. But before the pilots could even begin the checklist associated with the failure of the equipment, their worst fears became true. With a loud bang, the first officer's window shattered into 1,000 small pieces, which were partially sucked outwards by the explosive release of cabin pressure. A small portion of them were, however, blown inwards at 75% the speed of sound, hitting and injuring the first officer. But this was the least of his concerns. As the cabin pressure vented through the hole where the windshield used to be, it created a very powerful rush of air, lifting the first officer out of his seat and sucking him partially outside the window frame for a short while. Fortunately, he had worn his lap belt tightly. Otherwise, he would have probably fallen from the aircraft. Thanks to this, he was able to pull himself back into the cockpit. But not only the first officer was affected by the violent decompression. Parts of the glare shield, including parts of the flight control unit, were sucked outside and departed the aircraft. This unit is full of controls and switches through which the pilots control the autopilot. As the first officer was able to settle back into his seat, he was blasted with air at temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius, that's conveniently also minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In the cabin, the yellow oxygen masks were released automatically for the passengers. Also, the cockpit door slammed open violently as the cabin pressure was released through the flight deck. Now, the pilots were confronted with a plethora of warnings displayed on the ECAM, the electronic aircraft monitoring system. 4 of 5 flight computers had failed, as well as many other systems. The first officer was no longer able to fly the aircraft due to the violent rush of air, so the captain had to take over. He initiated the emergency descent, but at first, the crew was only able to descend to about 24,000 feet due to the mountains below. Meanwhile, as the cabin pressure dropped, the need to wear an oxygen mask arose, but the captain was unable to put on his mask. He had to control the aircraft using his left hand on the side stick, but this made it impossible for him to reach his oxygen mask, which was stored to the left of him. Meanwhile, the aircraft had developed a dangerous attitude, in which it banked over 50 degrees to the left. Finally, the captain was able to regain control, fortunately. After the crew had managed to leave the mountain range west of Chengdu behind, they were finally able to descend to 10,000 feet, where breathing without a mask was again possible. The captain never managed to reach his oxygen mask, but still, he managed to stay conscious the entire time. But now, a challenging landing lay ahead of the crew. The A319 was above its certified maximum landing weight. Communication with air traffic control was impossible due to the noise level in the cockpit, and there were more technical faults than the pilots could count. Still, the crew managed to set up the aircraft for a landing while flying a wide circle close to the airport. Eventually, the captain touched the stricken Airbus down on runway 02 right in Chengdu, about 35 minutes after the windshield had shattered. Due to the many failures and the heavy weight of the aircraft, it touched down at a higher speed than normal. Additionally, only 4 of the 10 ground spoiler panels deployed on top of the wings, which made it harder for the A319 to stop. Eventually, both right main gear wheels burst due to the stress put on them, but the captain managed to stop the partially windowless plane on the runway safely. Now, finally, the pilots were able to contact Chengdu Tower to report that they were safe, but had several injuries on board. Also, the plane was disabled on the runway and had to be towed. After their ordeal, the crew and the passengers were able to disembark from the damaged airliner. Only 2 people were injured: a flight attendant who received a wrist injury, and the first officer who had suffered facial abrasions, a minor right eye injury and a sprained wrist. There are also pictures of him showing that he had suffered several cuts due to the broken glass. None of the pilots were affected by asphyxia or frostbite, which to me is quite amazing. This is the first officer's shirt after the flight. Let's just say that this guy was very lucky in a bad situation. Now, let's take a closer look at the investigation. We start at the most obvious point, the windshield of an Airbus A319. It's made from layers of glass and plexiglass and can be heated electrically. This is done via a very thin metallized layer which can be warmed up by an electrical current. Fractures of these windshields are rare, but not unheard of. If you think about it, the stresses these windows have to endure are quite high. Often, they experience outside air temperatures as low as -70 degrees Celsius or -94 degrees Fahrenheit, while they are internally heated to temperatures in the range of 40 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The tension in the glass panes therefore sometimes leads to cracks in the windows. But there are other reasons for cracked cockpit windows, such as hail or bird strikes. In the case of Sichuan Airlines Flight 8633, however, the reason was simple but unexpected. A seal at the lower edge of the cockpit window had been damaged and permitted moisture to accumulate in the area where the live power wires connected to the heating element of the windshield. This in turn permitted arcing to occur, which is a phenomenon that produces quite a large amount of localized heat. Ironically, this localized overheating of the heating element connectors put so much internal stress on the windshield that it eventually cracked and shattered completely. But the investigation uncovered more interesting facts. After the events of 9/11, intrusion-proof cockpit doors were mandated. These are incredibly sturdy, bulletproof and quite heavy. When they were first installed, aircraft manufacturers realized that there was an edge case that could go very badly. If there was an explosive decompression in the cockpit, the entire cabin pressure would now no longer be held by the cockpit structure and the hull, but by the cockpit door itself. Therefore, the manufacturers decided to add a pressure sensing device to the cockpit door opening mechanism. If the very unlikely event of a cockpit decompression was ever to happen, the door would automatically open so that the cabin air could escape unhindered and without damaging the door or surrounding structure. What the designers of this system, however, didn't account for was the violence with which the cockpit door would open in such an event, as the pilots of Sichuan 8633 found out the hard way. When the cockpit door opened after the decompression just as intended, it swung open very violently. It slammed into the side of the circuit breaker wall with such force that it tripped up to 17 circuit breakers at once. Among the failed systems were also 4 of the 5 flight control computers. I really hope Airbus improves this design. To be fair though, many of the tripped circuit breakers could also have tripped due to the fact that parts of the flight control unit were ripped from the aircraft. After the accident, Airbus revised the checklist for cracked cockpit windows. The very first action pilots now have to do if they detect a broken windshield is to fasten their shoulder straps to avoid being sucked outside of the aircraft if the window was to burst. The pilots of Flight 8633 were highly praised by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. They said, quote, "In summary, the crew controlled the flight status of the aircraft, reporting the emergency to ATC, keeping the aircraft above safe altitude, etc., performing all key operations in line with company manual requirements." The 3 pilots of the flight, Liu Chuanzhan, Liang Peng and First Officer Xu Rushen, stayed with Sichuan Airlines. The first officer fully recovered from his injuries and the aircraft was repaired and returned to service in January 2019. The entire ordeal was even made into a Chinese movie called The Captain. It's a bit cheesy and overly dramatized, but if you want to watch something foreign for once, check it out. It's quite entertaining. The dramatized live-action scenes in this video are snippets from that movie. So, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever heard about this flight before? It crossed my path the first time when our checklists were revised due to this accident, and I've wanted to make a video about it ever since. If you'd like to see more interesting aviation accident coverage, check out my other videos. A special thanks also to my Patreons on Patreon. If you too would like to support this channel, head over to Patreon to discover many cool benefits. That said, thank you for watching and see you all in the next one.